Tippy toes, bend the knees, split hop. Hey everyone, welcome to class. Today's practice is a little bit something different. Sometimes when I'm trying to find inspiration for what classes to bring next, the first question I always ask myself is, what is it that I think the community would benefit from? What do you guys need? Based on what's already here, what's missing? And a lot of times I ask you directly, and other times I'm just kind of thinking it through myself. And this is just sort of from my own brain. As I'm looking at all these classes that we have in Bad Yogi Studio, I was thinking to myself, you know what? A lot of you have been practicing for a long time, probably on your own at home the majority of the time. And it's nice to just have a little checkup. Like, you go to the doctor for your physical and you just sort of get a general idea of where things are and are you on the right track and do I need to tweak anything? And this is kind of that. So I basically just took a bunch of notes that I wanted to go through with you. I want you to think of this as sort of conversational, so you can sit down, you can take notes. We're going to be doing a few things together, just kind of tweaking poses and going through some form cues, and then also just chatting a little bit. So kind of like a workshop style thing. The first thing that I want you to think of this as is really just, this is sort of an overview, because a lot of times when we've been practicing for a really long time, and I include myself in this as well, when we've been practicing for a lot of time, we tend to lose a little bit of mindfulness in the simplest poses. So whether it's something very common you do all the time, I'm not talking about the poses that are difficult that you're working towards, but the ones that you kind of take for granted, the ones that you do as a transition to get to another one, So we're going to take this opportunity to just go through some of the ones that I know when I'm teaching a class in person. I look out to my students and I'm like, this percentage of people is doing this particular pose a little bit incorrectly, or a way that I think could be made more efficient. So that's what we're going to be doing in this class. And I think where I want to start is, let's go through plank to chaturanga. We're just going to jump right into it, plank to chaturanga. So first, when we think of plank to chaturanga, if you do vinyasa flow, this is really part of almost every practice that you do, right? So again, it's one of those poses that's easily taken for granted, but also easily done incorrectly. And when I say incorrectly, I'm not putting like a moral tag on what you're doing. This is strictly like a word that I'm using to convey a sense of loss of intention behind it, So when you're moving through your plank, and you can do a kind of a chill plank, do a plank on your knees. And I'm sorry I'm wearing this sweater. It's so cold in the studio today already. So I didn't have the heart to wear a tank top. But in your plank, you know sort of the things to look for. You can keep the knees down because we're going to talk through it a little bit. But your shoulders don't have to be directly over the wrists. That can put a lot of pressure on the wrists themselves. You can shift back a tiny bit so that the 90-degree angle is not down here, but up here in the armpit. Sometimes that helps a little bit. So when your plank is correct, the crease of the elbows are facing forward, your belly is moving back towards the spine, and your rib cage is hugging back as well. So the lower back is neutral. You don't have an over-exaggerated arch, like the pelvis isn't tilting anywhere. Everything is really neutral, and those stabilizer muscles in the core are doing the majority of the work. Yes, you're going to feel it in the shoulders. Yes, you might feel it in the legs too, especially as we're holding and just talking it up like this. But you can sit back on your heels. When you're in your plank, even though the plank is a transition is like you're passing through plank to get down to chaturanga, use that opportunity, use that breath that you take in plank to cue into your body. So think of, especially in vinyasa flow, I know I'm using the word transition a lot, but transitory poses is like the nature of vinyasa, right? Like you're in a pose for a couple breaths usually, if not a little bit less. So you don't have a lot of time in them to really focus on dropping in and connecting to your body. Sometimes we miss that entirely when we're in a flow. So I'm using plank as the example, but take your 1 or 2 breaths and connect to one particular part of the pose that you can connect to easily. So in plank, maybe it's that cue with 90 degrees in the armpit, not the wrist. Make sure your alignment feels good to you. And maybe the next time you go through plank, hug the rib cage in. Keep some of these things at the forefront of your mind while you're practicing, so that when you only have a breath or two, you don't have to be like, frazzled, wondering what I should be focusing on right now. Am I doing this right? On to the next one, before you've ever had a chance to even assess how you feel in that one moment. So even though each pose is kind of a snapshot because it's pretty quick in vinyasa flow, when you're in your plank, take one or two cues, one or two parts of your body that you can immediately hone in on and adjust accordingly. So a couple of the ones that I see most commonly are what I just talked about. So you can borrow those if you don't have another one you want to tap into. So when you're moving through your flow, you move from down dog to plank, 90 degrees in the armpit. And then as we exhale, we're going to lower down to chaturanga. So now we're going to move through chaturanga real quick and break that down. I'm going to be on my knees again because as I'm talking, and I'm sure you might want to do the same, as I'm talking, it's tough to just hold chaturanga, right? Okay, so once we've established some of those key elements of our plank, our core is on, we have a nice comfortable angle in the wrist and in the shoulders. Now as we start to lower down between the elbows, you might notice that it feels more comfortable to shift your weight just a touch before you start to lower down. And in order to keep the wrists comfortable in chaturanga so that you don't just want to collapse to the floor, is to not shift too far forward. A lot of times what I see in classes is people really overemphasize that shift. And then what happens is they dip the chest straight down and the shoulder is all out of alignment as well. So you're not shifting that far forward. You're not over dramatizing the shift. It's just a tiny bit. Just a really small amount, so that as you lower, the center of gravity moves, like the chest is moving down between the thumbs. Oh, here's a good, I like really literal cues, so that's what we're gonna do. When you lower down between the thumbs, it's almost like roughly nipples to thumbs, like that's kind of where you're landing. So your chest should not land forward ahead of the fingers. You want to just take it straight down. Another thing I'll emphasize is in your chaturanga, lower is not better. I know you know that. I know you know it. But because we're on autopilot when we're doing these things that are very familiar, we tend to think that we're not doing something and then we're actually doing that thing that we thought we weren't doing. So pay attention the next time you're doing your chaturanga. It's another one of those we take for granted a lot. And as you're lowering, just drop like halfway of what you normally would, like here. So this is definitely not a 90-degree angle for me in my elbows, but it feels a lot better and more sustainable that I'm here than dropping too far down, because then I can also hold it for like a hair longer than the other version. So let's just take like a practice easy going from down dog. We're taking like a half of vinyasa. From down dog, nice and slow, inhale, shift forward to plank. Exhale, lower just halfway. Then take it down slowly. And now we would move into cobra or up dog. But notice what a difference it makes just infusing some of those poses with like a little bit of intention and mindfulness. Yeah, we know how to do them. Like we've all been doing this for a while, right? If we've been practicing together for any length of time, you've been doing this, this is not your first rodeo, right? But just coming back to the basics and reminding yourself what I should be feeling, how I should be feeling it, can really go a very long way. So another thing that we're gonna do in our checkup is talk about cobra versus up dog. And I know that you know the difference by now, just very briefly. Cobra, the whole lower half of the body stays on the ground. You're just lifting the chest and the elbows stay bent. In up dog, so I won't break it down fully, but cobra, whole lower half is down, my elbows stay bent. It's a really mild sort of back bend. Up dog is a little bit more intense. The whole lower half of the body comes off the ground. You're kicking into the tops of the feet. Elbows are straight, they're locked out. The chest is lifting up towards the sky. This is a much more intense version. So I'm gonna just assume that you know the difference. You know when you're doing one versus the other. But what I want to emphasize for this one, the piece of mindfulness that I want you to bring back into those poses for yourself the next time you're flowing, is the element of where the back is bending. So what's very, very common, regardless of which one you're doing, but we'll use Cobra as an example. What's very, very common is when we get a little bit lazy, we lose that mindfulness, we just sort of push up. So if you come down like you're gonna do Cobra, but just push into the hands, don't activate the legs, just push up into the hands. The lower back takes the brunt of this, lower back down, right? I mean, sure, that's fine. I mean, I don't think there's anything really injurious about this unless you're dramatizing it. But just because it's not harmful doesn't mean you're getting a benefit, right? So the next time you are moving up into Cobra, moving up into Up Dog, think about really using the whole body. What is the intention I want to have here? You want to be strong and supported through the legs, kicking into the feet gently, making contact with the floor. So the legs are active, like the quads are engaged, you're pressing into the mat, and then you're just sort of kind of lightly pressing into the hands and using the strength of the back to actually peel the torso up a little bit. So it is a very active pose. And that's the case with a lot of poses. We can make them more active or we can make them more passive by varying the amount of effort we put into it. And this isn't about making poses harder because you're working harder, but it's just about treating our bodies well by being aware of how we're moving through these poses. Because, I know that even though they're familiar, they're not necessarily super natural for the body to take, like bending backwards. I don't know how natural that would be for us if we were just living our lives like living in the forest somewhere. I don't know. So when we're doing these things that are a little bit unnatural but healthy for you, it's important to do so mindfully. So the next time you're moving into Cobra or Up Dog, really slow it down by a breath or two and allow yourself to engage the lower half of the body and to open from the chest, not just bend straight back and let the lower back take the brunt of that back bend. I like to think of back bends as chest openers first. And I think the switch of focus allows you to have a safer, more conservative back bend that is still challenging for you, but also safe. And you'll know what I mean when you do the comparison like we just did. Just push up into the hands and see how it feels to dump into the low back. And then the second time around, really take it slowly and imagine the chest expanding, like you're moving the collarbones away from the midline and move from the chest first. Engage the muscles through the back to kind of pull yourself up and see what a difference that makes. Okay, I know I have a lot of things to go over with you. Playing chaturanga, this one comes up a lot, both in like live classes and what I hear people say online. So when you're in a low lunge, again, coming back to our yoga checkup, some complaints that you might have had throughout the years. In a kneeling lunge, the back knee is obviously down. One thing that I hear a lot is that the back knee hurts. Like, how do you lean your weight on the knee without it hurting? I totally get how that would seem like it's an impossible fix, but there's a couple things. So again, you've been here for a while, for enough time to know that you can probably fold the back of your mat and add cushion to under your knee. But what if you don't want to do that? One thing that I have found is look at your knee the way that it looks on the outside. You have your knee cap, right? And you'll notice that depending on how you move, like the tissue around the kneecap and the kneecap itself has some mobility, so it'll shift around. Sitting directly on the kneecap, like if your kneecap is what is taking the weight behind you, that is going to feel a little uncomfortable. So what I like to do is instead of putting my weight on the knee itself, I actually shift forward a little bit so that instead of my knee being the thing taking the weight on the mat, it's actually this spot above my kneecap. So just like half an inch to an inch above my knee is what's actually on the ground. So how I get to that point is once I'm in my kneeling lunge, I'm on my kneecap right now. I know that's not going to feel great. I sort of just kind of drag my leg forward a touch so that now the kneecap is further down and the top of my knee, like almost going into my quads, is the thing that's on the mat. So hopefully that makes sense. It's like a very subtle, small change, but it does make a difference with how you feel. Like now I'm on my knee and I can't stay there for very long because it feels weird. So it's normal for that to feel weird. I mean, we don't really need to be directly on our joints at any point. Okay. Another thing I want to go over. So I think it's really cool when you've been practicing for a while. A lot of these movements feel very familiar. And some days you just want to be like, I wonder if I could try this. Or, you know what, I'm just gonna call out, like I think every yogi's underlying wish and desire is that someday you want to do a handstand. Wouldn't that be cool? Wouldn't that be great if you could just sort of like float up into a handstand or jump forward and float forward? How do I get there though? So we're going to kind of answer this question in two parts. The first little thing that I like to add to my practice whenever I want to kind of level up a little bit and kind of increase the level of power I have is first, you just got to do it. So I will tell you, I'm just organizing my thoughts here. This is sort of casual and off the cuff, but when we think about inversions, when we think about how to hop forward, or jump forward, or float, float the feet up in a vinyasa flow, there's always this jump that has to be made. From the time that you feel like you've been working at this, like you've been taking these baby steps, and you're not fully committed to like kicking up into the handstand in the middle of the room, but you feel like you're ready to not necessarily have training wheels anymore. Like you're ready to move past the bunny hops, but not necessarily handstand in the middle of the room, right? There's this space from this point here where you still have your training wheels in the bunny hops, and then the space here where you're actually doing it. You're doing the handstands in the middle of the room. Like, how do you get from here to here is always the question. And the way I explain this needs to be done is you have to essentially, there's no way around pushing yourself outside that comfort zone. You've got to do it. At some point, you just have to be like, deep breath. Okay, I'm going to give this a try. And you cannot make that decision lightly. That has to be after, you've put in the time to really make sure you have the strength. You feel like you're pretty strong. You can do it. You're just scared. And we all know when that's the case. We all know when it's like, I think I could do this safely. I could try this safely, but I'm just really afraid, And the fear is what's stopping you, not necessarily your ability, but your confidence is what you doubt. So when that's the case, I would encourage you to edge like 10 to 20% outside of where you're comfortable. And a good way to do that is a couple ways. Obviously, we all know that maybe this is like the handstand beginnings, when you're going to move through your vinyasa, instead of just stepping up to the top of your mat, take a little hop. And as you're hopping, I want you to visualize getting the hips above the shoulders. So don't look forward. You're going to be keeping your gaze just ahead of the fingertips. And don't worry about anything else. Only visualize moving the hips over the shoulders. So tippy toes, bend the knees deeply, hop the hips nice and high over the shoulders, and then land down. Doesn't have to be a quiet land, doesn't have to be graceful, doesn't have to be anything like that. Just focus on that visual. Tippy toes, bend the knees, hop, and try to get the feet, close to the hands. And even if the feet don't get close to the hands, you know the drill. This is something that takes time, etc. But hop. At every opportunity that you have, take the hop up to the top of your mat instead of the step. Another version of this that I really, really like, this is probably my preferred, is to come up to the tippy toes. You're kind of doing the same thing. Bend the knees, but mid-air, split the feet and land with one foot forward. So tippy toes, so that one leg stays lifted. There's this idea, I'll do it again so you can see. Tippy toes, bend the knees, split hop, one leg stays lifted. And then maybe your warrior 1 or 2 or whatever the foot needs to do. When you're coming through to a single leg pose, that's a good option too. What was I just going to say to you? Can't remember the other thought I had on that. But essentially, there's no way around getting uncomfortable. Like, you're gonna have to be afraid and do it anyway. And I don't mean do the whole thing, right? Like, I don't mean just start doing handstands in the middle of the room. Doesn't matter how afraid you are, not at all. But these two things, when you're at that point where you know it's the fear that's stopping you, start incorporating these two types of hops and jumps into your vinyasa flow. And that will start getting you comfortable with the idea of your feet being overhead without any wall around you. And obviously there's nothing wrong with practicing against a wall so that you have that kind of safety net. But eventually you gotta let it go, right? So anyway, those are the two things that I want you to keep in mind if you're looking to like kind of level up your practice overall. All right, I've got two more big topics to cover, but I'm gonna include these in the full-length version of this class for Bad Yogi Studio. So I really do hope you've enjoyed this little yoga practice checkup so far. And if you wanna hear about staying accountable, how to maintain accountability to yourself, for yourself, and how to find and maintain the elusive motivation to stay on top of your practice, drop to the link below in the description of this class for a free 14-day trial to Bad Yogi Studio. That's where all of my full-length classes live. There are hundreds of them. I know you're gonna get a ton out of it and you have nothing to lose. 14 days for free. So thanks for joining me for this one. I hope to see you inside BYS and I will see you all next time.